Left-wing group writes playbook for Biden's federal takeover of elections. There's nothing nonpartisan about Biden's overly broad executive order directing every federal agency to focus on voter participation. The following is an adapted excerpt from the book Myth of Voter Suppression: The Left's Assault on Clean Elections. In March 2021, President Joe Biden signed an executive order directing every federal agency to focus on voter registration and participation in what appears to be a federally backed get-out-the-vote effort. Don't worry, we are assured this will be nonpartisan. The White House came back in September 2021 to explain federal agencies will be working with nonpartisan groups, but the Biden administration hasn't given many details about how this order is being implemented and who those nonpartisans are. What's key is that the executive order almost mirrors exactly what the left-wing group Demos produced in a policy brief shortly after Biden was elected. While other groups on the left often attempt to sound reasonable and pragmatic, Demos shows ideological leg in phrases like transforming America, rethinking capitalism, and global governance. So the liberal New York think tank's democracy program strikes one of its least threatening tones. Don't be fooled. It's about weaponizing the federal government to sign up as many Democrat voters as possible. Demos issued a report on December 3rd, 2020, titled Executive Action to Advance Democracy: What the Biden-Harris Administration and the Agency Can Do to Build a More Inclusive Democracy. Less than 2 months after taking office, Biden issued an executive order nearly identical to the Demos' demands about politicizing federal agencies. And they've also been quietly talking about it. It's one of Kamala's favorite things to talk about, is being inclusive with democracy and all these things, signing people up and not preventing them from voting. Things like voter IDs and stuff like that are terrible. It keeps people from voting. Lest there be any doubt about the organization's influence over this administration, it's important to know that 𝓟𝓛𝓔𝓐𝓢𔔔 Raymond was the president of Demos and Chirag Baines was the Demos Legal Strategies Director when the organization issued the briefing calling for Biden's executive actions. So it's no coincidence that Raymond became senior counsel for the Office of Management and Budget, which oversees the implementation of executive orders, as well as for the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, which oversees regulation. Baines is the Deputy Director of Racial Justice and Equity for the Domestic Policy Council, which the executive order identifies as taking the lead on the policy. A White House press release on March 5th, 2021 noted that Baines, while working at Demos, led voting rights litigation and advocacy across the country. 2 days after this press release, Biden issued the executive order. Demos previously partnered with Project Vote, an offshoot of Acorn, and the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law to lobby the federal and state governments against what it calls excessive voter identification requirements. Excessive identification requirements. The coalition wanted the motor voter law extended beyond registering voters at the Department of Motor Vehicles offices to include offices for welfare, Medicaid, food stamps, and other areas of public assistance where perhaps Democrat voters are more likely to be. Demos criticized the Obama administration for not using the healthcare.gov portal to sign up for Obamacare as a voting registration site. The marriage of government with turning out the partisan vote using social services as a sweetener is a throwback to the workings of Tammany Hall and Daily Machine and other Democrat Party traditions. After years of advocating using the power of government to benefit a single party, Demos issued its December 2020 recommendations for the incoming Biden-Harris administration in what turned out to be the blueprint for Biden's election agenda. The first of the 6-month recommendations says the Biden-Harris administration can make voting more accessible by directing specified federal agencies in their administration of federal programs to act as voter registration agencies, including providing voter registration applications, assisting clients to complete applications, and transmitting completed applications to state authorities. In an apparent response, Biden issued an overly broad executive order on March 7, 2021, ordering federal agencies to do exactly that. So here it is again, another rule by decree. Biden is just basically putting out what laws and stuff he wants made and he wants done. Things that aren't in his realm, he's going to control by making laws through executive order. The executive branch of the government being a legislative branch in his hands. Agencies shall consider ways to expand citizens' opportunities to register to vote and to obtain information about and participate in the electoral process. Biden's executive order says the head of each agency shall evaluate ways in which the agency can, as appropriate and consistent with applicable law, promote voter registration and voter participation. The order also says agencies are to expand citizens' opportunities to register to vote and to obtain information about and participate in the electoral process. The order directs agencies to focus on distributing voter registration and vote-by-mail ballot application forms, assisting applicants in completing voter registration and vote-by-mail ballot application forms, and soliciting and facilitating approved, nonpartisan third-party organizations and state officials to provide voter registration services on agency premises. Political groups invited onto federal government property. That can't go bad at all. And one of the biggest things that you see right now is there's a strong difference between what Republicans want with mail-in voting and what Democrats want for mail-in voting. For one, mail-in voting has been around for a long time, but it's always been strictly adhered to that the person asked for show their need for that ballot to be sent to them. The order also says agencies are to expand citizens' opportunities to register to vote and to obtain information about and participate in the electoral process. The order directs agencies to focus on distributing voter registration and vote-by-mail ballot application forms, assisting applicants in completing voter registration and vote-by-mail ballot application forms, and soliciting and facilitating approved nonpartisan third-party organizations and state officials to provide voter registration services on agency premises. So in other words, to invite all these partisan groups, election-involved political groups onto federal property, and maybe they can have some kind of really cool program like for every ballot, mail-in ballot and stuff that you give out, you can get a bonus or something, paid for by the Biden administration. Demo specifically singled out using U.S. citizens and immigration services to sign up new voters at naturalization ceremonies. Under Biden's executive order, the Department of Homeland Security's focus will be on voter registration at the end of naturalization ceremonies for the hundreds of thousands of citizens naturalized each year, according to the White House summary of agency plans. The second demo's recommendation for Biden's executive actions was to strengthen Department of Justice enforcement of and guidance on voting rights statutes and pursue aggressive civil and criminal enforcement of federal voting rights protections. What about voter fraud? Is the Department of Justice going to focus any on that? Are they going to investigate anything like that? Just people's voters' rights protections, huh? The Justice Department seems to have obliged, filing lawsuits against the election laws in Arizona, Georgia, and Texas, while also issuing election law guidance seemingly as a warning to other states. We find that a lot of things are being overturned in the courts, particularly when the non-legislative branches of government in some of these states have allowed the mail-in voting, under the emergency clauses and stuff that they claim to have had. They say, well, you can mail in the votes because we're in a pandemic. Joe Biden said the pandemic's over. These laws are not subject to those rules, and they have to be passed by the legislator of those states. It can't just be by some decree by a governor or something like that. Watch and see how this plays out, because the DOJ is just interfering with all these states' laws all around the country. Things that are supposed to be in the state's hands, the federal government's trying to take control of it. That's not how it's supposed to work. Apart from the executive order, Biden appointed top Justice Department officials with a long record of opposing any voter ID laws. Biden named 𝓟𝓛𝓔𝓐𝓢𝓔 Gupta as the Associate Attorney General. She returned to the department after running the Civil Rights Division during the Obama administration. During that run, she oversaw the 2015 lawsuit against North Carolina to attempt to block the voter ID law there. Biden also named Kristen Clarke as the Assistant Attorney General, who would lead the Civil Rights Division that oversees the voting section. As a private lawyer, Clarke led a lawsuit to stop the then Georgia Secretary of State Brian Kemp from enforcing election integrity policies. They don't like voter ID laws. And remember, the Democrats believe that people that are in the inner city can't get access to get IDs. And that's just wrong. And you're not talking about driver's licenses, because if you don't have a driver's license, you can still get a state ID. And that has nothing to do with having a suspended license or anything like that. Most people need them for day-to-day life. If you were a poor person living out far away from the city, I think you would have farther to go to try to get an ID, and you'd have more difficulty in getting an ID and finding a place to vote than you probably would if you were in an inner city. The third demo's recommendation was to provide more federal resources to the Election Assistance Commission. Under this category, demos called for the EAC to develop standards and best practices for mail and early voting and to encourage no-excuse voting by mail. Along those lines, the Biden executive order says agencies should provide ways to give information to people from government offices located throughout the United States, as well as online and social media, about how to register to vote, how to request a vote-by-mail ballot, and how to cast a ballot in upcoming elections, and ways to provide access to voter registration services and vote-by-mail ballot applications, and distributing voter registration and vote-by-mail ballot application forms. Why don't we just skip to what they want and just have vote by Twitter? The fourth demo's recommendation was create an office within the White House focused on advancing the administration's efforts to protect and strengthen democratic systems and civic participation. In April 2021, Biden named 𝓟𝓛𔔔𝓐𝓢𔔔 as his senior policy advisor for democracy and voting rights. Leavitt is a Loyola law professor who previously worked in the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division under the Obama administration. Leavitt worked for the George Soros-funded America Coming Together PAC and for the vote fraud denier group Brennan Center for Justice. In 2014, Leavitt wrote a Brennan Center report opposing voter ID laws. So George Soros linked again. The same people that make sure that, they get their DAs that they want all across the country elected, that throw out laws, don't enforce any laws, tell these big companies and stuff that are in California and everything, so what if you're robbed and all your inventory is stolen? That's not a big enough crime for us to do something. And then the police departments and everything cannot arrest any of those people, and their crime stats can reflect a drop in those areas because the law's not enforced. So if you don't have lawbreakers, you don't have a crime there, guess what? The crime stats go down. If you got rid of all the laws, crime would go to zero. The fifth recommendation calls for the Biden-Harris administration to strengthen the U.S. Postal Service's ability to deliver election mail. This suggestion surrounds the left's pre-2020 election postal conspiracy theories that Trump was somehow hijacking the Postal Service to get reelected. It was not part of Biden's executive order, but in July 2022, the U.S. Postal Service announced it was establishing a division to handle election mail. The sixth demo's suggestion was to end what it calls prison-based gerrymandering by requiring the Census Bureau to count federal prisoners at their last known address rather than at the prison they're incarcerated in. The theory behind this is that when it comes time for redistricting, prisoners are from urban areas that could add majority Democrat districts but are housed in rural areas, and thus will only add non-voting residents to expand likely Republican areas. The DOJ didn't address prison gerrymandering, but the executive order says the department shall provide educational materials related to voter registration and voting, and, to the extent practicable, to facilitate voter registration for all eligible individuals in the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, yet another likely Democrat constituency. And why is that? Because Democrats are more likely to be in prison? Let's be clear, it would be problematic for a Republican president or for a president of any party to direct the federal bureaucracy to engage in elections. It's difficult to see how the public shouldn't suspect the party in power would want to shift things in their favor. This is an absolute travesty that this president is using executive orders like laws to try to control things that he has no business playing in whatsoever. If there is something to be done that is left to the states, that's the stuff that the federal government is supposed to stay out of. And in particular, they want to control the way votes go for electing a president with the Electoral College. They're changing that. They're attempting to change that in Congress right now. They've done a bunch of things with passing laws for both Republicans and Democrats with mail-in voting. In some areas, they've secured it. Other areas, it's been thrown out and ruled by judges to be unconstitutional. And yet, they persist in having the DOJ try to punish those that are trying to get their election laws under control. Messing in the idea that states can do what they want with elections. Part of the problem is that we look at the election map from this last presidential run, and you had a president that was elected with the most people, the most votes, and the least amount of counties ever for a president. Those two things don't fit together so well. And it shows that one of the things you have a problem with is these large blue concentrations in big cities. And to top it off, some of these states have agreements with other states to make their electoral college votes go towards whoever has the highest number of votes. This is gerrymandering the vote. When you take it where California agrees to, no matter what happens with the election outcome with the electoral college, however many votes across the entire country, whoever gets the most number of votes, the popular vote, as it's called, would be where they would want to send their electoral votes, electoral college votes. You know, this is agreements that circumvent the Constitution, and yet that's what we're seeing from one end of the country to the other. All the blue areas want to dive right in, remove all kinds of checks, signature checks on votes, allow mail-in voting for anything, mail out 10 applications to all the last 10 people that lived at an apartment. And when they got all 10 of those back, they're not concerned in the slightest. They don't have any kind of check for that. Then to change the system overall where, you know, your votes count in a different way than what the Constitution laid out is just denying what our current laws and constitutional laws are. And it's nothing short of a run on trying to control politics. You know, even that whole idea of letting, you know, illegals vote. A lot of these places are passing laws. Illegals can already vote. Not federal yet, but that's coming. And I even remember a couple years back where California was going to automatically, everyone that got a license in California, which could be an illegal or not, anyone that gets a license would be automatically registered to vote. We need to keep an eye on this. We need to control this. The Democrats are running all over our system of rules and laws. They're running all over our Constitution. We're talking about trying to take an election and make it all about mail-in voting, trying to control it for no voter ID. This is a mess. This is the kind of thing that leads to elections not being very clear-cut. Most people don't have confidence in the election right now. And the system of voting that we've had over the pandemic, that needs to change nationwide. It needs to be secure.